Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Rogério Studart for being here after a complicated journey leaving the US until reach Campinas with canceled flights and canceled transportation and everything else that you can imagine. So, Professor is here for a few hours. And so it's really important for us that you've made it. And for those who don't know, Rogério Studart, he is a Brazilian economist that is in the US for a long time. Rogério used to be a professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And after that, he went to ECLAC, IDB, and the World Bank also, with leading positions there. And now Rogério is a senior researcher at the CEBRI, Center for International Relations, Brazilian International Relations. And that's it. He's going to join us for a while, and he's going to start the presentation, I think, right now. So it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Professor Dios. And let me start by thanking you. I think the last time I came here was so long ago that when Professor Dios asked me, start showing me things around, and said, well, what happened to the dinosaurs? And they disappeared. It's been a long time. But I had very good memories of this campus and the people here, so I'm really glad to have made it. It's not very usual for me to start, any talk by apologizing, but I have to give you 3 apologies. The first one is before the story that Professor Deus told you, is that when I was preparing this presentation, I was very humbled by the fact that I had more questions than answers. And people like academics to present answers. This is going to be more a disclosure to you of some of the questions I've been asking myself about theory, and I'll explain why I've been having these questions, and then presenting to you an advanced research on the issue, even though I've been working on this issue for a long while. The second is that as I was preparing, I'm really not only jet lagged but sleep deprived because my flight was canceled twice, and flying here was it was truly a nightmare. I couldn't sleep for the past 2 days more than 5 hours. So if you think I'm losing track of something or I'm not making sense, I'm not making sense. Do stop me and say, Rogério, you're not making sense. And that comes to the third apology, which I can't remember because I'm not really. That was 3, I remember. Yeah.
Have to apologize.
Yeah,
I forgot to
I forgot to apologize. Oh, yeah, this is something around there. Let's try to do it. Okay, I made a presentation. But do not stick to the presentation. PowerPoint presentations, in my view, are normally powerless and pointless. You stick your eyes on trying to copy. I'm going to redo the presentation and share with you, including because there are some of the readings that I have not presented to you in the program. And let me start with the questions and how I arrived here. So I'm a market economist by training. I had the privilege of being trained both in my master by great professors, including some of here still. But I had my master degree, Fernando Cardini Carvalho. He was the one introducing to me post-Keynesian economics. And then with Victoria Chick. Victoria Chick passed away 2 years ago. And I used to go to London very often. I still go to London often. And last time I saw Vicky, we had a 4-hour conversation about what was called the economics of enough. She was thinking about the challenge that climate change has been posing to economics and was very kind to share, to have this conversation with me. And we had a book outline before she passed away. She published the outline, and I'm still struggling how to put this together. Those are some of the initial thoughts about that. Okay, so let me go start, let me go back. I'm a market economist by training, and I'm an expert in in international finance. How did I come to climate change? In 2010, the second batch, I say, of my children, because I have a blended family, was born, twins. And then I was just at the time becoming aware of the reports coming from the United Nations looking at the climate emergency. And I got really scared about the future. I've always been concerned about development, economic, social and economic development. I decided to dedicate my professional career to learning and trying to collaborate a little bit on the issue of transitioning to a low carbon economy. So after that, I went to Brookings, I've been to several think tanks and organizations, but always looking at these issues. And only recent, the issue of how economics was dealing with climate change has made me concerned. I'll explain to you. Do we have a blackboard here? No. But you can think of the blackboard. I joined an institution called the World Resource Institute. It's a progressive institution. It was very interesting working with them, but the economists there, they were using models, generic liberal models, recursive generic liberal models, which basically ask the following question. If you have an economy that has a carbon footprint here, and you want to go to net zero in 2050, how do you change the structure? What are the investments that you have to make and change the structure in order to get here? And what are the investments in which sectors you have to make to get there? And then by using the output-input matrix of different types, you end up looking at how that process gets you here and how much output is created, how much employment is created, how much emission is reduced. The problem that I had with that immediately, or what you follow, as a market economist, there was no investment function. So there was no discussion. Investment came out as saying, this is how much you got to invest. The second thing for me, which was really a concern, is how is this financed? For me, with my experience, if you don't have an investment function, you don't discuss the sources of finance, there's no policy, there's nothing. Okay? So I decided to start looking at that in a serious way, a very confused way, to be frank, because, and that's what I go to the first thing. To the first PowerPoint slide, who's managing this? I have to do it right here. Is it myself? Is this? Okay. So the question that I had is, I became an economist as a political economist. So I was going, my first background was Marxism, but I took very seriously to look at the questions that economics have been asking since its inception. And I think that we all look at Adam Smith as the first economist. As a matter of fact, he was an economic philosopher. He had a question that was really related to the time that he was dealing with the issues, which was this. There was an emerging market economy. That was completely new. Socially meant that the structure, think about a feudal society. You have the production, the allocation of production determined by someone, right? The king, the queen, whatever. Okay? The structure is well defined. Then you have the emergency of an economy which is decentralized, where production and distribution are taken by different people, and the allocation of resources will be taken from different people. So his question was, is this sustainable? Or is this going to sustainable in the political economy point of view? Is this going to result in cohesion, or is it going to disintegrate? Okay, so his answer was not an answer, was a hypothesis. He said, this is an economy that leads to specialization. With that, with productivity. And the productivity increase would allow for the economy to grow and at the same time provide for those who are, in different classes. And that could trickle down, resulting in a cohesive economic system. So his answer was positive, but at the same time saying, but you need the state in order to avoid the concentration of power to creating new kings and queens. So that was his question. He was not making any assumption, oh, how did I do that? How did I do that? Okay, sorry. So that comes, and I'm jumping. I mean, there's a whole history there. I'm jumping just to get to the point. Of course, I'm jumping Marshall, but I'm saying, Valras, what is Valras asking? Well, if this is a decentralized economy, and is it stable? Can I prove that there is a general equilibrium point, which is going to, at the same time, is stable and can maximize the returns for all the agents involved? His answer was yes, using a general equilibrium model and making some very strong assumptions about what markets are. Okay, that was became kind of the classical thing, but the idea behind it is the market. First of all, you can define markets as individuals trying to maximize returns and utilities, and that you can show that using some assumptions about, for instance, the distribution of information about price flexibilities and power, you can get the results that Valras got, and that became kind of the main core of I think that, I think that Keynes changed the conversation substantially. Keynes founded or established macroeconomics. In what sense? Valras is basically microeconomics, right? He's saying that you don't have to look at the macro results, because if the macroeconomic results are optimal, then the macroeconomic results have got to be optimal. Keynes said no. He was very opportunistic in a sense by saying there are some fallacies of composition. He was using the macroeconomic Valrasian approach, but say, well, but there are some issues that have when you put the collective, the result is something different. He had a completely different approach of that. I say he was opportunistic because in the general theory, he did not want, for instance, after having written the treatise on money and the treatise on probability and the treatise on money, he did not want to have that conversation. He wanted to persuade people. So, and that it was, I think, a strategic mistake. Who am I to say that Keynes was strategically mistaken, right? It is my perception is that we lost a lot in that conversation. The other person that impressed me in my trajectory, of course, was Schumpeter. Because Schumpeter was also asking the same question. Remember that before that, Marx had said, this is a system that has contradictions. Two of them. The first of one is the tendency for diminishing return, which would lead capitalists to have no, basically no sources of sustainable dynamics. The second thing is that the capitalists created an industrial workers in cities, and that politically would lead to potential revolution. system change. So Peter gives an answer to Marx by saying, no, this is a system that is led by creative destruction. So productivity is revamped over and over again by a system, as long as you allow entrepreneurs to have access to the finance, to the means of payments required for the investments to take place. That was a major change. It was not addressed by Keynes, but Keynes had a different kind of conversation. Minsley is not Minsley, it's Minsky. It's another person that is really impressive in terms of looking at this. Minsky was saying, okay, even if we can stabilize this market economy, like Keynes was proposing by demand management, stabilizing this leads to instability, and that's his financial fragility hypothesis. But I think that, and I wish I had a blackboard here, but you think with me. The discussion after Keynes, and of course, if you don't introduce Peter, has been the capacity of using demand management in order to stabilize the economy. Keynes, as we know, okay, this is Laura. This is the hypothesis that you have a self-regulating system that is efficient. It leads to market efficiency in every market, okay, including the financial market, which for me is an expression of itself. Are we okay until now? Okay, I promise I'm going to get to climate very soon. So Keynes in the I put the first chapter. Nobody looks at the first chapter generally. I've read it, I think, 100 times because I love it. I love it. Why? Keynes was basically saying, listen, I'm going to show in this book to you that what you have been teaching doesn't make any sense. It's not that it doesn't make any sense. Economic theory, any kind of theory, is a synthesis of in order to deal with some complexity. You can look at economy in any ways, but you have to have a simplified model to explain it. Keynes used a simplified model to explain the macroeconomics. But what he was saying is that the simplification used in Walrasian economics was not only misleading, but would be dangerous. That's what he said. I love it when he says that. I shall argue that the postulates of classical theory applicable to special case, and only and not to the general case, which is basically he's saying this idea that the market is self-regulated and is going to reach a general equilibrium that is efficient and stable is completely misleading. It's wrong, it's misleading, because this is a special case of a general situation. And we're going to talk about the general situation. And this, with the result that his teaching is misleading and disastrous if we attempt to apply to the facts of experience. That was built in a previous development, its intellectual development that Keynes had, which was to ask, what is the best way to explain, to understand modern market economies? And he called that the monetary theory of production. There's a beautiful, small speech that he gave in Germany talking about that. What he was saying is this: the problem about the Walrasian equilibrium models is not so much that it is wrong. There's no such thing as wrong and right when theorizing. Okay? Is that it comes to an economy, visualizing an economy when money does not exist. It's not that it does not exist. There's no relevance for money. And he would say, money, the creation of the modern money economy, it is really the basis of the development of all market economies. And explain a lot why those economies are not self-regulating and tend to have an equilibrium which is below not only the use of resources, but also of efficiency, macroeconomic efficiency. How he does that is basically looks at money as a contract, a social contract. Money, bank money was created before state money. That's a funny thing about this. History, forget about history, think about the logic, okay? When you start being able to use some source of means of payment that's widely accepted, then that is when money is established as a means of payment, but also a means of settling conflicts. So I'm going in spot and future conflicts. I'm going to hire you, for instance, to pass my presentation here. What do you accept a means of payment? Something that is socially accepted or socially imposed, okay? So socially accepted money has existed in different forms, okay? One of those forms has become very common in the emergence of market economies, which is bank money. Okay? At some point, the state took over the definition of establishing what is the means of payment. And by doing that, took for itself the power to command resources. So basically, Keynes was saying, money is a contract, a social contract that allows for accessing the resources of economy and putting to work either for production or investment. That changed the hierarchy of the structure. First, it is whoever is capable of having access to the means of payment or to the creation of means of payment that is going to rule the world. It's not consumers, it's not savers. The first is whoever is capable of doing that. Capable of doing that. First is the productive investors that have access to someone or something that provides liquidity, means of payment. Okay, that is the most important thing. Somebody has got to have the economic or social power to say to the king, or to say to a bank, or to say to an institutional investor, whoever, give me the liquidity because I want to use the resources in order to produce or to invest. The second, of course, is the state. The state, because it issues a means of payments that it has established itself as the way of making payments and transferring resources or settling contracts. So if I say to you again, I'm going to hire you, but in 3 months for you to produce this and give it to me, the only way I can settle this contract is by providing the person with a means of payments that they settle. The third, banks, and banks have become, you see a discussion of Schumpeter and Keynes, banks as, a key actor in the process. Banks are still very important because they're capable of issuing means of payment through the creation that allows them to have to provide the liquidity. But banks have become outdated in modern capitalism in relation to other sources or other types of institutions and markets, such as bond markets. We're going to see that. And then financial wealth holders. Financial wealth holders, either in the form of physical wealth, meaning real estate or gold or silver or whatever, or liquid assets, they can use those assets in order to obtain the means of payments required either to transfer or themselves to use for using resources. That's when liquidity preference of these actors become really clear. Why is that? Because you have to have a combination of liquidity preference and the money required to obtain resources and to make investments that is compatible with full employment of resources. What Keynes was saying is that in a world of uncertainty, and uncertainty here is not, Keynes did not discover uncertainty. It doesn't make any sense. Everybody knew what uncertainty was. But that is a theoretical category. He's saying that people have to use whatever information they have in order to forecast the future, okay? if the future is, in their view, is changing substantially, or if the future is not knowing, giving the information that you had in the past, and Stiglitz used that a lot in order to break with the Eurasian system, then you can say you can have swings of optimism and pessimism that leads to different liquidity preference of all these actors that are going to result in a macroeconomic equilibrium that is below that required for free employment. I've been talking for too long, sorry. Yeah, I want to get to the point. So, because I got fascinated with this, okay, I'm sorry. But basically, he was looking, and in the general theory, he drops all that to say, okay, there is a macroeconomic problem here, there's a fallacy here. Even if macroeconomically the system can be efficient on a macroeconomic perspective because liquidity money exists, and money creates the possibility of liquidity preference changes, affecting the level of uses of resources, you can have a system that what Pareto would call suboptimal, okay? And that was his question. So what do we do with that? We use the state, we use government, we send an external agents to that to manage and aggregate demand in order to get a more efficient macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay? That was all he needed to show. And for that, in order to persuade, he said, I'm not going to talk about this. If you guys want to listen about, learn about money in a modern, in a monetary production economy, go to the treatise on money. If you want to learn about probability and uncertainty and how that affects the behavior of agents, go to my treatise on probability. Okay? He was very efficient in doing that because after that, all we have been discussing as economists are the same topic. You have an aggregate supply and aggregate demand. What do you do? Can you shift the so-called classical and neoclassical economists are going to say supplies cannot be changed, but with aggregate demand policies and heterodox economists are going to say no, supply can actually shift if you shift aggregate demand, and that is going to create a level of macroeconomic equilibrium which is more efficient. Okay? So this is, if I had a blackboard, just think, go the other thing. You have supply and demand, and if you listen, for instance, to my friend, well, we don't know, perhaps most of you do not know Samuel Pessoa, it was the other day saying exactly the same thing. There's no way you can move the economy to a higher level of production because there is an equilibrium, macroeconomic equilibrium. If you do that, you're going to be just having inflation. You cannot change the supply side of the economics by changing aggregate demand. All you do is just end up with price increases. Most of us would say exactly the opposite way. So, hey, I just read his article, so it's in my mind. So somehow maybe 10% unemployment in Brazil is not exactly, macroeconomic equilibrium. Maybe you could change that by increasing this, there's a better use of resources by managing aggregate demand. But the discussion has always been around the aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve that in some ways you say it's more or less flexible. Okay. And now it doesn't work. It says, am I doing something wrong?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I jumped some patches, some feature. Yeah. Okay. So Keynes made that proposition in general theory. Of course, we could add to that proposition. By the way, I just found out just months ago, and I shared that with you. Schumpeter has a treatise on money, and I read it. Okay, I was really surprised. It's very similar to Keynes' approach, so similar that he dropped it. Once Keynes came out with a treatise on money, he dropped it. So no, but it is very similar. But his main contribution to the discussions on the supply side and saying, okay, how can the supply side change? How does the supply side change in in a modern market economy. Okay, we're going to come back to this because this is really, it's even more important in my view than to the issue of climate than it is our heterodox approach to supply and demand. Another very important, it's so important in so many levels, but so important economists in my mind for the discussion on climate change, because I'm trying to put together a way of looking from an economic perspective, what are the questions that we should be asking by the climate change crisis? It's, of course, Minsky. Minsky had what became known as the financial fragility hypothesis. And basically, it was saying this, okay, when you make an investment of some kind and which engenders economic growth, you basically scratching the mismatch between your investment, the maturity of your investment, and the maturity of how you're funding your investments. That itself, if that itself makes, like, put in a very practical way, makes you more scared, and that changes the perception of risk. Remember, the risk has been defined in the Tobinian perspective as the distribution of events, of past events, and how you transform the distribution of past events in just a small equation to show that this is risk, okay? And looking at a normal or a different distribution. I hope that I'm not jumping too fast on that, okay? But he was assuming that you had the information, he was not assuming that you had uncertainty. What Minsky does is say, okay, let's look at uncertainty the way that Knight and Keynes define that, and let's say that as in the process of investing more and growing, the economy tends to change the perception of risk of the key agents. Do not worry about the PowerPoint. I promise I'll share with you. I just want this is just to organize my presentation. But what Minsky brought to us is that perception of risk can change in the process of growth and investment. And when that happens, you end up by perceiving your postures, your financial postures, as fragile. And when that happens, you can change your mind, because liquidity preference is what rules the world. If investors or the bankers or any other agent that is critical for growth and development change their mind about the perception of risk, that can lead to a decline of investment and therefore aggregate demand and therefore income, and therefore that starts a process what Minsky called asset deflation. What Minsky does not bring, and is going to be very important, but it could be a pillar for that discussion, is what happens in an economy where climate risk is increasing so fast that the agencies start perceiving that as fragility and therefore change the way they change the liquidity preference, but also change the way they want to be exposed. But we can come back to that. Okay, this is a little bit more. So, let me see. Yeah. Okay, this was a little bit dramatic, but it's that amount. Okay. Yeah, that is not working. Right? Okay. So the bottom line is that, in my view, and this is what it was a humbling exercise, in my view, the questions that are being posed by economics, and particularly by market economics, for a long time, including from heterodox economists, need to be readdressed in face of climate emergency. Why? Because you're coming from a discussion of whether the economy is self-regulated, okay, and that you do not need to intervene in managing aggregate supply demand, and you cannot change the aggregate supply to an economy that is self-destructive. That we haven't perceived that until very recently, and very recently, this process of a self-destructive economy has been accelerated by what some of us, including Professor Dios, like to call extreme. Is it extreme neoliberalism? I can't remember the expression that we want. It's but anyways, it's in the past 30 years extreme neoliberalism. So the question becomes: are we still having a discussion about whether the economy is self-regulating, and if we had to management aggregate demand? The second, I said no. It has become more a discussion of what we do when growth and expansion economy leads to the destruction of the natural inputs that are necessary for the prosperity of this economy. Okay. Now, before I go here, I'll stop here with the dramatic. If you want to discuss, have I missed something here that you think it doesn't make any sense? You can say it. That's okay. Use the excuse that I had to. Any question? By the way, do we have a break?
If you want to have a break, you
Yeah.
can go straight, or you can have a break.
That's a 20, so 40, it's going to be 50 minutes now. Okay, so let's go into this. I mean, the situation is really dramatic. This graph did not express the tragedy that we're living in. I mean, if you look at greenhouse gases in total, this graph does not make a pretty good because of the axis. But what you see observed from here from 1970 to 2002, only in CO2 there has been a doubling of emission. Okay. When you look at the other ones, there has been an increase, but the carbon emission has been quite significant. This has to do with, particularly the acceleration since the 1980s, has to do with the geopolitical change, significant change, which was opening the United States, opening up trade and investment policies to China and Asian countries, creating what I would call a G2, it's not a G7, a very rapid increase of trade between those two areas, which created at the last, I believe, something that one could call a consumer of last resource and the producer of last resource in a scale that is unprecedented. So if you look at that, this is an interesting thing. Everybody looks at the largest emitters of carbon in the world. But in fact, if you look at trade and how much what is produced in countries when it comes to the carbon footprint of what is produced is exported to another country, you're going to be astonished to see, for instance, that the trade with China and the United States, basically which goes this way here, has one of the largest carbon footprint of the whole international trade, and it has been expanding very rapidly in the past 30 years. So you have a way of producing which is very carbon intensive, and a way of consuming which is very carbon intensive, that leads to a spiking of acceleration of carbon emission. And that acceleration of carbon emissions is what is of carbon and greenhouse gases emissions is what is really causing the fast change in climate. And this is the final result of this process is more or less what you observe here. And those are the overshoot dates. This is when in a year you have emitted GAG enough to that GHG that the Earth is capable of absorbing. So every year, the Earth, with all the plants, all the trees, and everything else, can absorb X. Okay, so X is achieved, and you can see it in 1977 in December. X is achieved in more or less July in 2023, which means that the Earth is not capable of absorbing this GHG amounts anymore. Which means that if you, and this has to do with the expansion of what I would call, and I see that with no judgment because I love the United States, it's not something that I would make a judgment. It's just a systemic problem of the capitalist economy. If everybody in the world start using the US, the American dream in terms of consumptions and partner consumptions, you need 5 Earths in order to sustain that. Of course, that is not possible. And you can see that this is not, it's not, well. That means, and where is that coming from? When you look at CO2, basically industry, power industry and mobility. And here, of course, in some countries, land use. That's what you got to change. You have to change the way you use resources, the type of infrastructure when it comes to mobility and so on, so that you can maintain that one sustainable. Okay. I think I'm going to ask you for a 5-minute break because I think I kind of lost it. Is that okay? Give me 5 minutes and we come back and we continue from here. And any questions that you had in terms of what I've been presenting so far? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think that what I want to bring to your attention is that clearly climate change drive us to the supply side issues that are completely different from the supply side issues of orthodox economics, but it's not also much addressed by the non-Schumpeterian heterodox economics. And the issue is that in order to go back into sustainability, and that has got to be done in an urgent way. And why is it so urgent? For 2 reasons. Because we have already achieved a level of disruption that is significant, is causing not only the destruction of biodiversity and biomas, but also extreme climate events that are unprecedented. And what is now become a source of uncertainty, which is going to start affecting very quickly the way market economies function, is because the rate of change is not even understood by the scientists now. I'll give you an example to you. You probably have heard about the fires in Canada, and Philippe is there. I was talking to a climate scientist. First of all, they have not been extinguished. They don't even know how to deal at the moment with a fire that size. But there's something called zombie fires, which is the fires that remain underneath the surface, that never extinguish, and they can come back as fire in different moments. There are several cases now. It used to be exceptional in nature, and has become very common. I don't want to scare you too much, but the situation is scary, okay? So there is a need for a rapid change. That's why people talk about climate emergency. You have to have a substantial change on the supply side. And we are not exactly working on this issue. You know, we have to, it's important to remember that the idea of changing supply side was more associated with industrial policy. And industrial policy has been left outside, and not by chance that industrial policy is coming back to fashion, because most countries, including the United States and developing economies, are introducing industrial policy. What is industrial policy? For a developing country, is building new sectors towards development. In an industrial economy, is reshaping its supply, aggregate supply. And what needs to be changed? First, you have, it's very clear when it comes to carbon emission, which has been the one increasing faster, even though you have all the other sources of GHG. Emissions have been the ones that I just showed them. And where are they coming from? Power, industry, mobility, buildings, agriculture. 31% of that comes off using oil. That's the most significant part. 17%, sorry, the second most significant part. Natural gas, coal. We still live in a world of coal, and many developing countries are very dependent on coal as a source of commodity. But for the production industrial economies, coal is still very much what it is. The no energy is creation of carbon emissions is only 17%. So there is a supply side change that needs to be done, particularly from industrial economies, which is quite significant. Now, I'm sorry, we're going to have slides here that should be in different parts, but I'll talk about that anyways, and I apologize for that. It's part of my pre-apology, okay? What is the good news about that is that the market economies have been losing dynamism for a while. And now with geopolitical fragmentation, you have a problem of how to continue to create the jobs in order to create social cohesion in countries. And the good news is that this is a McKinsey report, but you find this kind of numbers in other parts, is that it should be clear that when you change the supply side of the economy, you also create opportunities. A lot of people are going to lose jobs in old fossil fuels, intensive sectors, but there's going to be a lot of jobs created. And for industrial economies particularly, this is very appealing. And that also creates some appeals for development. So there is going to be a shift, but most of the analysis that you have, and this is an educated guesses, is that jobs will be created through the process. Yeah. Sorry. That's why I couldn't find it. Yeah, that's what should have come before, so I apologize for that. So what is really important is not just the production, but what is how you consume the inputs. And you can see that the use of power, in the power industry, the manufacturing industry, the mobilities, but then you have buildings, agriculture, but those three are the main sources of carbon emissions that have to be changed. It's really fantastic when you look around, you drive around, and you have a different lenses in looking at the supply chain constraints that you face, that we don't notice that the streets, you probably do, are covered with fossil fuel products. The tires, the cars have been created for a fossil fuel. The whole industrial economy of the world have been created based on fossil fuel. It's only natural that the only way you can change that is by revamping the way you produce, the way you transport goods and people, and the way you consume, particularly the goods. So what is, this is my least liked slide, because I wanted to make a point and I couldn't make a point, and I just gave up trying to do that. I think that when you look at the aggregate supply and demand issues that we have in front of us, this is a traditional discussion, right? If you look, if you want to increase production, if you can, if heterodox economists say that you can manage demand in order to create a higher, you can create a little bit of inflation, but you can create higher output, right? The discussion that we have to have nowadays is that just by maintaining a level, whatever level of macroeconomic equilibrium, is going to result in shifts in the supply side economics. Why is that? Because you start depleting the very resources that you need in order to maintain a certain level of supply. So the idea that I had, and I did not manage, was to show to you that you have intergenerational or intertemporal problem of how you do macroeconomics without disconsidering the future effects that is going to have on supply and demand. So on the supply side, what you have to think, and this is what Schumpeter's approach comes in, is how you can invest in innovation, how you produce innovation, and that is required to change the way you use resources. There's no incentive for that. Why? First of all, because profits are still made in significant levels by using existing systems and using the existing vehicles. The second thing is that a friend of mine who is a Sergio Vilera, sorry, forgot. Huh? Sergio Vilera. He brought me to, I think he wrote a piece in the Brazilian newspaper saying it is fantastic how company car sales speed, right? You always, this macho thing of people driving a car and racing. I don't even understand what's so significant about that. But the fact is there's a whole industry related to fossil fuel, either as producers or users, that can use all the political marketing influence in order to maintain this trajectory. If you're still making money out of that, you're going to still continue to do that. I do not see how you can change that without imposing some very large penalties. And that has to do with pricing carbon emission. And it is a dramatic issue because it's not just a political issue, it's an economic survival issue. We can come back to that. The second thing is that you have to enhance resilience in the supply side and adaptability. There is a march, I don't know if you ever read the book March of the Falling. It was written by a historian called Bob Buckman. Basically, she was fed up with the Vietnam War, and she wanted, and there were people saying, "Oh, there's going to be change." And she was making the point that a different part of the history of mankind, the elite, the economic and political elite, was marching to a situation of tragedy, catastrophe, and they could not stop. It's a little bit what's happening now. I think that all the sectors leaders and political leaders understand that their own business are being affected by that. One which is primarily responding to that, you probably read every day that an institutional investor, a large bank, or so on is going into sustainable finance. The story behind that, of course, there are good people there, very few good people there, say that we're doing that for the future of the planet. But think about a pension fund or an institutional investor that has in its own portfolio real estate in California or in Canada, right? They by regulation have got to diversify their investments because their investments are becoming what is called stranded assets, meaning that assets that are going to be losing their values very soon due to climate change related risks. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. On the demand side, you have to restructure demand. through this process. You have to be able, and this is where the American dream becomes an American nightmare. You have to rethink and redo your consumption partners in order to achieve a simultaneous, that's what I wanted to show, a simultaneous shift of supply that way, and this is what I failed badly, and I promise in the final version of this is going to come out nice, and a supply, but use your imagination. You see that in front of you, you have a completely different question than the ones that have been posed to all economists, orthodox and heterodox economists. And then you have to transition to net zero. This is going to require, and this is what I'm going to be talking after this, is going to require significant investment and significant changes. If I can get there, of course, yeah. This is some of the estimates. It seemed quite extraordinary. Again, I use McKinsey because what McKinsey does, they use a lot of studies. One of those I have myself developed, and aggregate that in order to produce the numbers, the significant numbers that you have in front of you. So they say here, and this is a trick that always puzzles me. Spending of physical assets for energy and energy systems in net zero 2050 scenario would rise to about 9.3 trillion annually. So they look at that, of course, they want to sell this as an opportunity of investment. What they're talking about is increasing investment in CapEx, in infrastructure and production at the level that is $9.2 trillion, which is not that much when it comes to overall world GDP, but it's quite substantially when it comes to mobilization of resources. What they're not saying is that this is an opportunity, but someone has got to finance. And this is where the issue of finance comes very strikingly as important. Again, the same thing would entail around 273 trillion in cumulative investments accumulated, over 30 years. What they fail to say, this is what something that always bothered me in this discussion, is that there's no discussion of who is going to invest and who is going to finance. For instance, in the United States now, with the investment, with Inflation Reduction Act, you ask who is going to finance, invest, you have one answer, the state. Why is that? Because the United States, and this is a discussion that we've been having for a long while, has the privilege of issuing means of payments that is accepted universally, and therefore they can just say the state is going to do it, they do it. Most of infrastructure in the United States is financed from the budget. Most of it is just a question of transforming that budget into finance from the central bank financing credit. In other countries, you should have a degree of flexibility, but some of them, like Brazil, for instance, impose to itself a macroeconomic settings that is so constrained that you don't have the fiscal space to do. I'll give you an example of it. So-called Brazil has been, I don't know how many of you are here from Brazil. Okay, a few of you. So Brazil and many other countries in the region have created laws of fiscal responsibility, but also fiscal frameworks that are very constrained beyond what I think would be possible. They also have significant debts, and that puts pressure on them for international institutions to maintain fiscal austerity. Therefore, those countries have Brazil has only 70 billion reais, which is about $14 billion of expected investments coming from the government for the forthcoming years. That is not enough to touch, the problem of resilience and adaptation in those areas. So in some countries, because they have plenty of capacity to finance, or they don't care about it, or they don't have the framework, the state is taking the lead. And why is the state taking the lead? because it is, from the point of view of finance, it's very difficult to undertake these investments. Okay, I don't know why this is here, I have no idea, but it's basically saying that this is the old, the traditional view, the economists say, look at that, is to say, well, you need to have savings in order to do this finance. And what Keynes basically said, and that's what he broke with this whole thing, said, no, you have to have the capacity to issue liquidity and provide means of payments. But that's not, no, this is here. Okay. Why is finance, and this is what Minsky comes about. Remember that I said that in Minsky framework, whenever you invest, and invest is transformational, it changes somehow the overall structure of the economy. It's not just risk, it's perceived risk. You have to take the chances of making an investment that is going to become a flow of returns in the future, right? So, and you cannot, when you're doing transformational investment, and I want to make sure that we understand what I'm talking about. When I'm saying transformation investment, is an investment that is going to change the environment. So you cannot use the past to foresee what is going to happen in the future. For instance, when you're investing in changing the way people produce, the type of energy sources that they use, and consumption, you do not have an experience in that to evaluate the risks as well as, for instance, if you want to invest in increasing your productive capacity of an industry that is established. And when it comes to climate, this is even more important. Why? Because climate is creating two types of risks that are completely new. First, the physical risks. As I said, the number of extreme climate events has been increasing, not only increasing, but accelerating the way that even scientists could not expect. Therefore, you do not know if you're producing now a dam, or if you're producing now a resort in front of the beach, or if you're producing anything, if you're thinking about the future, you're completely uncertain about the physical risk and how that is going to impact your flow of returns in the future. So this becomes, for those financing and those investing, sources of extreme uncertainty. Okay? And then you have the transition risk. The transition risk is associated with societal changes that end up impacting the returns of your company. For instance, if tomorrow the European Union managed, or the European Union, or any large consumers, or the United States decided to say, we're not going to import from countries that have very large carbon footprint, that would mean the collapse of the US-China trade. By the way, it is the same discussion as cocaine in the United States, right? You say, well, we have to attack those countries that produce cocaine. But the fact is that you have, unless you stop the consumption of cocaine in the United States, and I'm talking about the United States, but think about other countries, about Canada. They think they behave well. It's not thinking. But it's the same thing. I mean, if you one day the United States wake up and say, we're going to start buying the conditionality, just like they had human rights before, not really China, or copyrights, they don't have any China, it's one story we have to talk about. They said, we're not going to import goods with high carbon footprint that would end the production in China, which produces a significant amount of coal as energy input. By the way, the Chinese know that, and they're trying to change it very quickly to renewable energy, so they are not impacted by transitional risk. Of course, the Chinese are also concerned with the climate, not taking their part, but there's an economic rationale for that. So, climate regulation instability, acceleration of adoption of disruptive technologies, what does that mean? that as, if you have been following, for instance, the price of renewable energy has been declining very rapidly, and the cost of producing solar and wind has been declining very rapidly, which means that the price of oil pretty soon is going to be higher than the price of producing with renewable energy. And that allows for disruptive technologies, and this is going to have systemic impact. Changes in consumer preference. If out of it, as I said, if consumers and citizens manage to impose changes in regulations and say, we're not going to eat, I don't know, buy gadgets or buy large cars that are not electric cars, that is going to change substantially the transition to this. And finally, I don't know why I put question of quality of information. Never mind, but I think what I wanted to say that is that risk, again, it's uncertain. Because you do not have the good quality of information on how this disruptive technologies are impacting the system, that may impact your perception of risk. So for the for the financiers, but for the investors and the financiers which rule the world, their liquidity change preference, and this I like to put it that way, can be changing very rapidly because of the certainties created by climate change. The other thing which is interesting, remember when I put in the first paragraphs that the hierarchy of those who command the resources in the economy. Now start with the investors that are the ones that have access, that can have access and once you use the resources. Then it came banks, wealth holders, and so on. One thing that has been happening is that the inequality, income inequality and wealth inequality has created a concentration of the capacity to command means of payments and therefore command resources in the hands of very few. What does that mean? Is that, for instance, it creates some, it creates a very high dependency for change in the hands of investors, particularly those that are fossil fuel invested or vested into interest and environmental predators. So the tendency for that dynamics to continue is very, very strong. The second, governments. Because of the global wealth concentration, there is, and particularly in where I live in the United States nowadays, the capacity of the lobbying of those vested interests is quite significant. So making any change, for instance, that's why I found it so interesting that Biden, of all people, managed to introduce the Inflation Reduction Act. And he only did that as an act of somebody to say, if I don't do it now, 80 years old, I'm going to die pretty soon, but I'm going to carry it with me and everybody else. Government, fiscal constraints also. This is an interesting thing because fiscal constraints in most countries is just, and Professor Delson was going to say about that, it's a social created constraint. But the stronger that powers the stronger concentration of wealth in the hand of few, particularly of financial wealth, creates a pressure for not changing that at all. Why? It is easy for you to say, I don't want the state to be the financier, I will provide the financing with the costs that I am saying that it's going to be because of my liquidity. Does it make any sense to you? If the state had a very proactive fiscal policy and uses monetary capacity, then the return that those institutional investors would have would be very limited. That's why they got so upset in the past few years that interest rates have been negative in developed nations. And that's why they got so upset here in Brazil, for instance, and several other developing countries here, when they say, well, we're going to reduce our interest rates from 10 to 5, which is absurd. But why is there resistance? You have a very good excuse, which is conventional macroeconomic thinking, but also it reduces, why should I do that if I'm the greater beneficiary of having high rates of returns? When it comes to finance, banks continue to be, the one thing that I found astonishing, I did a study on the Amazon, and I was responsible for finance. I found out that the financing going to the Amazon region here in Brazil, 87% was associated with destructive businesses and investments. I'm going to repeat to you, 87%. 13% was public banks. To think that bankers who are making money, finance whatever, are going to change that just for the future of the planet, I think it's not part of the market story, okay? I'm not saying that there are bad bakers or good bakers. It's just that, just like me now, I'm trying to be a good lecturer, and I'm going to try to maximize this, even though I'm jet lagged, I'm sleep deprived, my family did not understand me. I'll do my best to maximize my utility function. So bankers are the same thing. To ask that, of course, there are bankers that, have that concern, but there's a herd behavior that is going to lead them to have a conservative approach. Financial markets, climate risk is rising very quickly. And that's why you observe, for instance, if you look at the numbers and when it comes to green bonds, it's going to be astonished that the two parts, what is growing faster. One is in developed nations that need very few, very little increment in terms of providing bond financing to investments because they already exist. So in Europe, it's growing very fast. In the United States, it's growing very fast. Only 5% of green bonds markets is going to countries that do not have access to low-income financing. And why that is, we can talk a little bit about that. But the other country is China. China has made a policy of linking industrial policies with changes in the financial market that has been leading to incredible increase of green bonds, green bonds market. Finally, financial wealth concentration, we talked about this. So this is the situation. You have that there must be, you must think, and this is a question for economists in the future, particularly financial economists, how you change. There's no way of thinking that the state, because of the constraints that I mentioned to you, is going to be able to deal with this level of investment. How you make significant changes in how the financial actors are allocating their portfolios in order to get the change. So, okay. Here we go. What are the questions that we are left with them? First of all, I think the big question that we have to address in the future is the political economy of climate change when you have a highly unequal world, and therefore no the market economy being incapable of addressing, even a humanitarian way to address this issue. What is the policy that can guide the market towards that kind of change and therefore that kind of the volumes required for resource mobilization? The second question is how do you do mitigation but at the same time maintaining the levels of output, or at least producing prosperity for most of the people that have not access to that. So and that requires thinking about transforming the current infrastructure, the production capacity. We need to think about preservation as well. This is so critical, a critical issue that nobody knows to address thus far. For instance, when you have the whole discussion on the Amazon region, what do you do in order to provide prosperity for the 35 million people living there? This is the same questions in other biomes. You have to address the issue of just transition, both in existing productive infrastructure, but also those who are not that are part of the biomes and the natural web. Adaptation, and this is the second, how do you induce adaptation? And how you promote adaptation? It strikes me as odd, the capacity of people looking forward to the impacts of extreme climate events on the infrastructure. Look at for instance, the Belo Monte here in Brazil. I mean, that was only 10 years ago, and it's already facing droughts. That could be having seen, of course, not only has significant social impacts, but now we have a situation that infrastructure is losing its capacity to provide services. Okay? But there is how do you accelerate the understanding and the application of adaptation? So the final point is related to finance that I want to say. I mean, the amounts are so incredible that you think, what is this going to come forward? For adaptation, and I can share that with you. It's only for mitigation, it's much more significant, because in some countries, you have to change the way infrastructure is built, the existing infrastructure productive sector. In developing countries, you're building new ones. It should be easier. That's why you have an opportunity in developing countries. I mean, if you had a geopolitical system that looked at sustainability on a global level, it would make much more sense to promote sustainable infrastructure, sustainable production in developing countries. Again, that is difficult to achieve. This same thing I'm going to share this with you. But the point that I was going to make is that there's a huge confusion between stock of wealth and flows of loanable funds. What is happening nowadays is that climate risk is imposing financial investors and financial intermediaries a change in portfolio allocation, which is creating loanable funds to sustainable projects. Okay, this is very clear. For instance, the development of the green bonds. Nevertheless, making these institutional investors make a portfolio change is basically changing the liquidity price. It is enforcing them the idea that you have to shift from one thing to another. This is the greatest challenge that you have in finance nowadays. And why do I say it's the greatest part? Because if you look at the numbers, the stocks of bonds is almost the same level of banks. Banks are also buying bonds, and therefore the stock of bonds, it's those holding bonds around the world, and the way they allocate the portfolio is going to determine how much loanable funds you have available. Of course, you also can have a state that says, what the heck, I don't care about that. I'm going to keep interest rates low, and I'm going to finance this thing. I'll favor that, but the political economy of that seems to be even more complicated. Okay, let me go to the conclusion, because we're all tired and exhausted. Okay? Okay. Remember when I talked about economics of enough? I think it's the Victoria Chick, we had this discussion. To be very frank, I could not understand completely what the point she was coming from. I think it's the point she was coming from. That's what I've been working on. And I'm trying to put together the book that she left for us to write. Is this: we never had a situation since the Industrial Revolution where the aggregate supply is being depleted in that speed. That creates macroeconomic issues that are beyond the discussions that we have among heterodox, but in between heterodox and orthodox economists as a whole. And of course, I am of the view that orthodox economics is completely lost because it doesn't have even the pillars to understand the functioning of a market economy and the economics of transformation. That's why I went back to Keynes, Studart, and Keynesian. Second issue, the needs of transformation were very significant. That requires resource mobilization and application that was very high. That leads to questions about the macroeconomic setting, fiscal policy, monetary policy, but also it comes to issues in finance. We have to admit that heterodox economics has its own shortcoming. I wish I could have heard what Felipe was talking before, but I'm quite sure that it had some points that interface with that. Is that we are living from the economics of abundance to the economics of enough. We have to take this seriously. But we have the tools to that. We have the knowledge of understanding a different way of how monetary economy, production economy works. We have Schumpeter to understand a little bit of innovation and its impacts, and we have Minsky as a basis to look at the new the existing and new risks emerging from climate change. The policy, of course, you have to have good theory in order to do good policy. There's no escape from it. This is why it was driving me crazy, because we are so behind on the theory that in order to do policy, we get lost. We get lost and start doing things in an ad hoc way, but we have to have good theoretical discussion. So we need to work really hard and get the theoretical part together in order to talk about the economics of enough and the transformation in times of high inequality and climate emergency. I think that the first issue is to determine if we have supply side conditions for change. Remember when Keynes said that this is a special case, the neoclassical case is a special case? He was talking about a case that a macroeconomic equilibrium is full use of resources. Okay? The question that you have to ask, and he said, well, until we get there, we can use demand management. Well, the question that you have to ask now is that, do we have the supply side resources needed for that transformation? And what change we have to do in how we manage aggregate demand in order to get an optimal macroeconomic result, but at the same time leads to transformation. Okay? Second, mobilizing resources, it has to be thought in a completely different way for the reasons that I said, including the issue of how to address the risks involved. And this comes to the question of what kind of policies we can create in order to accelerate some processes that are happening or create other processes that do not exist. I think this is perhaps the greatest challenge that we have at political economy today. I apologize that I don't have the answers to you. I'm looking at you. You must be at least 30 years younger than me, and I hope that you do very fast. Okay? Thank you very much. That's all. I think we don't have any time.
Yeah, we have 7 minutes for questions, if you want to take some questions.
No, yeah, I don't know if I can give answers, but I can take questions.
Yeah, so we can collect some questions from the audience.
Just a quick question. I don't think I saw Pilecki in your slides. Where would you put the economics of Pilecki?
I think economists are Kaleski everywhere, very frank. And I think I think you're not going to like this answer. When I put Minsky, in a way, Minsky brings Kaleski. But you're right, I should have brought Kaleski. Okay? Yes.
I have a question on when you say about that we have scarce resource and we have to deal with the fact that I mean this is a bit it is something a bit strange for me since when we think about the oil industry, what we are seeing nowadays is that at more that we search for more oil, we do find more oil. And that's the issue, because it seems to be abundant. I mean, if we dig a little bit more, we just find out a new big resource in Amazonas, in forest, and the problem is that if we innovate in how do you say that? I'm already hungry. No, I'm not thinking enough, but in renewable energies, and the price gets lower, and okay, but what happens is that sometimes if we start consuming more of this kind of energy, and you have, I mean, perhaps you will reduce the demand for oil use. Okay, this is good, but the fact that if the oil prices are big, you know, sometimes they can find more oil. And I think that's my point is that we don't have scarce. We are not scarce in this field. You know, we are abundant, and that's a big issue, because it will be always kind of lucrative to study some more. So the political economy thing today about this special thing is that we have to find a way to like find his interests. I mean, to like okay, it's lucrative, but we will not explore.
This is a very good question. I want you to answer that, not answer, but debate that with you, because I think you have the right questions, and you probably have to solve them by yourself. I can at least give you some clues. Okay, I'll be right back with you, Debbie. Your question.
So, congratulations for your presentation. Thank you very much. But my question is more provocation. You can work about like the introduction of all financial development and scarcity of these resources. And it seems to be like the financial wealth investors are more focused on how they can translate their financial wealth on like oil assets to living assets. And the fact is that in the time we live that we won't be able to translate all this like $200 trillion of financial assets in oil directly to green assets. So my question is, how did the state interact with these financial wealth investors and like start a real revolution? And because I think their main concern is we are going to lose all these financial assets. We are going to lose all this money.
This is another very good question. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the presentation. My question is kind of like close to this question. I mean, like, you talked a lot about like the supplier side of the problem, and my intention, my question is like actually to think about the supplier side of the ones that are going to be most affected by the green transition process. For example, like if we look at the capitalist managers of the oil companies, they don't seem at all to be concerned about the green transition. I mean, like nowadays, the United States has kind of like a Green Deal. So why is that? Like the United States has always been controlled by the oil and gas companies. Why is that happening right now? And for me, the only answer for that is that the technology that we have is not going to actually tackle down their demand. And I connect that thinking with like an article, like an interview that I read in 2019, which actually the CEO of ExxonMobil, one of the most brutal and at the same time one of the biggest oil companies in the world, he said that he was relaxed about the green transition because if he could actually take all the technology that we had in 2019 and transform all of the vehicles in the world, they would have the same demand of 2030. So there's like a huge problem in like, for example, ships. We have like ships that can be electric. We have airplanes that can actually take people all over the world that are electric. So I know it's not an easy question, but at the same time, like how do you can overcome that?
This is I think it's very good questions. I think that one issue is the issue of scarcity, and this is going to make me work a little bit on that, because when I talk about scarcity, I'm talking about intertemporal process where your supply capacity can increase the depletion of resources is increasing faster. So where he says, yeah, you can continue to increase supply of whether it's oil in order to produce the same sources of energy. But that production of oil, use of oil as energy, is going to lead to extreme climate events that is going to impact supply in parts. It's going to impact our capacity as a global society to produce goods for the population. Think instinctively about it. So the people that, when you have droughts and you have floods and you have, how many people are moving from one place because they cannot use the resources, the natural resources anymore, trying to find another place. Think that at a global level, and you're going to see that this problem is going to start getting more and more acute. So you're right. If you think of supply side in traditional way, but if you're thinking temporally, you can think that the capacity to increase supply is going to be challenging other parts of the supply chain and therefore create more disruption. And that's what I meant by that. But you're going to make me write and talk more about that. Thank you. How the state and financial wealth. I wanted to emphasize, I brought Minsky, I want to emphasize the issues of physical and transition risk, because I think there's a market-driven force already working. Why is that? I mean, those investors, they are allocators of portfolio in risk and uncertain environments, right? So they are perceiving every day, they wake up in the morning, they open the newspaper, and another 400 houses are being burned in Denver, where I was just a few days ago. And they say, oh gosh, why do I do that? Because I finance a significant part of those mortgages. So what they have to do, even by regulation, is to diversify portfolio. This is already happening. I think the state has the role of accelerating these things by saying, we're going to make you use climate risk as part of the regulatory buying process. So basically, the central bank in Brazil has done that, by the way. Several other central banks, you have to increase the price of holding risk, just like you did in other crises, by the way. I mean, when you have after the subprime crisis, there was a change in regulation, which, of course, Trump destroyed after he came, that basically said, now you guys have got to be worried about subprime and other types of large investments. If the central bank does that, and the other regulatory agencies do that, you're just accelerating the trade, okay? And if you put that, you link that with, that's what the Chinese were doing well, but other countries, the United States is doing that as well. Germany is doing that. With industrial policy, they say, and if you invest in solar, you're going to have a return that is guaranteed in the future investing transformation. Because what the investors want is to reduce uncertainty. One way of reducing uncertainty is saying the asset, the projects, the investments, and the business that are backing our investments have some backing from me. I'm going to guarantee this in the future. So this is how I think that could be done. Again, may not be sufficient, but it would be interesting to do the financial modeling for them. Supply side technology has trickled down. Repeat the question, because I think it was related to his question.
Yeah, it was related. The powers that the oil companies have in the United States or all over the world, and they don't seem at all that to be concerned about green resistance, which means that basically their demand is not going to change that much. The technology that we have nowadays.
Oh yeah, this is semantic, to be very frank. I mean, from Shell, because they're saying to their own investors, their own stockholders, we're not concerned. We have a because otherwise they're going to lose market value. This is what it is. They know, and that's the reason why they invest in significant liberalization. They know that they're going to end up with stranded assets. either because of the physical risks or because of the transition risks. They are all the energy industry in the world, except for Petrobras until very recently, has become an energy transition. Why they are doing that? Because they're thinking about the planet. Yeah, some of them wake up and say, oh, I have kids. But the thing is, that there's a market again. Things in a market economy, things happen when you have market force behind them. Either because they emerge because of the risks, or because they're created by state intervention. Let's go to the moon. Okay, you want to go to the moon, to a green moon? Okay, the state is going to say, okay, I'm going to deal with your uncertainty in the future when it comes to the demand side. You deal with your uncertainty on the supply side. That's how it happens. Listen, we have to stop here.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bearing with my jet lag, this sleep deprivation, and so on. Thank you very much. That's very good.